I'm going to give a suggestion about how to think about the relationship among the different papers. I was taking a lot of notes when all four of the panelists were speaking, and it's pretty complicated to do, but I think a very simple heuristic is the following. Take Uskali's talk as the starting point, and he presents a wide variety of categories of possible stances, that is, toward the question of Homo economicus and the underlying philosophy of science issues. And then you'll find that at least for Eldar and Rachel, and it was harder for me to do with Sam's talk, but with Eldar and Rachel, I think the mappings are pretty clear. Rachel, I believe, and she agreed, I'm not imagining this, Rachel takes the position of a thickener in Uskali's terms. So you start with the classical expected utility model, you keep the old arguments of the function, and then you add identity. And so that's the relationship between her work and Uskali's set of possible categories of ways of thinking about it. Eldar's approach is very different, at least the version that I heard today. It was regarding the issue of Popper's falsificationism. The theories you should try to falsify theories, not confirm them. That's really the mark of a scientific theory. But then one of his followers, Imre Lakatos, a great philosopher of science in his own right, came up with a distinction between naive falsificationism and sophisticated falsificationism. And Eldar's approach starts with the very blunt facts that some of the assumptions of the classical theory are simply inaccurate. They're bad approximations. So think about his approach as telling PhD students in econ, yeah, you may have been told that all theories are false and some are useful, in Sinu's words, but some are really bad approximations, and I'm going to tell you how bad the approximations are. I leave it to Sam to try and map himself into Uskali's categories. Okay, I would rather not start with a prompt, but just let the four experts hopefully challenge each other, or on the other hand, see links, or see syntheses, or see outright inconsistencies. The last would be fun.
Well, I'll start with an objection to the title of the meeting. Is that good enough?
Sure.
It's too late. It's too late for that.
You would be disappointed if I didn't say something like that, David. Look, I think that Homo economicus was and is just a bad idea, evolving or otherwise. And I say this knowing that any social science which will be either predictive or moral has to embrace some notion of intentionality, that people are trying to do things when they're acting. But Homo economicus seems to me to be a wrong turn that we made, thanks to, I think, the first real statement of this was John Stuart Mill. And by the way, I think you already know, John Stuart Mill is among the economists and philosophers I admire the most. But here's what he wrote. Political economy does not treat the whole of man's nature as modified by the social state, nor by the whole conduct of man in society. It is concerned with him only as a being who desires to possess wealth and who is capable of judging the comparative efficiency of means for obtaining that end. Now, that's a very nice statement about Homo economicus, because it's not arrogant. It says, look, this just happens to be what we're going to study. Now, the question is, if you want to understand economics, is that a good way to study? I'm not saying if you want to understand sociology. I'm saying, suppose all you care about is economics. Is that a good idea? It obviously is not a good idea. We now know that to decide about, for example, wage setting, you cannot just think about people as wealth maximizers, either employers or workers for that matter. That what's happened in economics in the last 50 years partly because of the behavioral revolution, but partly also because of the incomplete contracts revolution, is that being interdisciplinary is no longer optional if you're going to be a good economist. It's not a question we should study religion and families and other things. No. You want to study price setting, you want to study wage setting, you want to study how banks operate and so on. You have to be interdisciplinary. So Mill's idea, which is you can take this thing, separate it off, and study it separately, by the way, not a bad idea. That's how science often progresses, by setting up artificial boundaries, developing a specialized language within that, and then proceeding. But it didn't work. It had to do with some assumption.
Compared to what, Sam?
What?
Compared to what? That is, what's the counterfactual here? I mean,
you don't mean counterfactual, you mean alternative, right?
No, the counterfactual.
Oh,
if they hadn't gone down this route.
The counterfactual is that Mill proceeded as a very good social scientist, which he was, did not sell economists on the idea that you can be a good scientist adopting his view of the world with these silos. That was a mistake. It was a mistake because of the explanatory power of models that leaves out things other than wealth maximization is very limited. And it's based on assumptions of separability, technically, in terms of how we respond to motives and so on, and also complete contracts, both of which we now know are simply not true in most of the cases under study. So I think we should just give Homo economicus a decent burial.
Rachel, can I cold call you?
Yeah, sure.
It was a response to that. Or in the general topic.
I'll tell you what I've been thinking about as sort of the day goes on and now. I agree with a lot of what Sam said. But I think that Kali also had this nice list of when we can change paradigms and when we can't. And we are in a world where we have people who are so I'm going to sort of self-analyze, analyze our own profession, right? We're in a world where we're trying to make progress. People are trying to make careers. People are trying to get publications in the top 5 journals. There are rules and norms about how economists themselves, or any discipline, has rules and norms for what constitutes research. And I completely agree with what you've said. I'm just thinking, how do we actually get there? And when we're in a system where people are actually working within a system to do good work, but also get published and get tenure, it's very hard to change paradigms. And so your list, I think, was. Scully was very good about, when do you change paradigm? You had a list of, network externalities, et cetera. I forget what was in your whole list. So when we're thinking about the evolution of Homo economicus or the evolution of our methods, we have to think about it in the context that we're all in a little microeconomy here doing our thing. So I'm not sure it was exactly what you were looking for as responding to Sam, but it was just going through my head as I've been thinking. You got my thoughts. You got some of my thoughts there.
Can I just add, saying that Sam is talking about an idealized world that does not exist. It's an epistemic world with very, very idealized properties, of which we now do not exist, and this is what you were talking about. Mm-hmm. So you keep dreaming.
Sorry, economics is moving in a direction which I would recommend. So don't tell me that I'm dreaming. Look what's happening around you.
No, I think it is.
But you made a stronger statement
Look
than
at
that,
what's getting
Sam.
published.
Sure. No, the thing is, I think, well, I guess I'd say that yes, it is moving, but can we wholesale, bury Homo economic? Maybe we can eventually, but we have to be aware of all of the other forces that are around that are pushing people in different directions, including individuals trying to, publish and trying to understand how to get by. And we even have debates over what it means. In some sense, this is all a big debate over what it means to be an economist in some sense. That's also part of the discussion we're having here without actually saying it, and now I said it.
So I'm going to be in the unlikely position of trying to resurrect Homo economicus. If by that we mean a rational agent model roughly, I see it as a beautiful empirical discovery of what people think is the right thing to do. You wouldn't throw away the 10 Commandments. They suck, nobody obeys them, but they're a beautiful idea.
I think they're a better
So-
idea than Homo economicus.
Okay, but I think Homo economicus is quite useful as an empirical discovery. You know, if you do a Socratic method interview with sophomores on campus, they're going to give you the axioms.
Yeah.
We're transitive, we're this, we're that. So I think it's beautiful. But then, those who thought I was critiquing economics, it was really, I'm not in that business at all. I think it does a great job, and we have to enrich it. I have no idea how. The smart theoreticians will do that. But we have to enrich it to capture many of the things that classical Homo economics was not doing, and that are part of the way people do them. Now, Benoit's point, I totally agree, and I don't take it as a critique because I think nobody does it better. People are incredibly weird. They think about all kinds of stuff. You come to them with something and they're thinking about their daughter that moment, and it looks completely different than it did 10 minutes ago. I mean, when economists estimate utility functions, they're not doing better than we are. Nobody is. So people are complicated. We only get the qualitative effects, not the quantitative effects. It's true. I think I presented to you a study with South Africa where we manipulated 10 different features in a letter. And the pictures worked really strongly. The table worked really strongly. Some things didn't. Here is one. Race manipulation. This is South Africa. Didn't do much. Very counterintuitive. On the average, the 10 things we tried, on the average, each thing had a 1% interest rate equivalent effect, but some much bigger, some much smaller. Now, if I took that to Stockholm or Riyadh, I have no reason whatsoever to expect that the pictures and the tables would be the best thing again. And so I think and this is, by the way, contributing to the replication crisis we have. I think if I took the 10 things to Riyadh, I'm pretty sure some of the 10 will have an impact. It may not be the pictures this time. Maybe race will surprise us in Sweden when it didn't work in South Africa. Who knows? But I think the method is going to be to do that, to say I have 10 candidates, these will have an impact on people. I don't know which ones. And now I can predict something, not quite quantitatively, but I can have more confidence that I will have captured something in my net as opposed to focusing on just replicating one thing, which again, with people's crazy mental life, we're just not going to do.
So I want to pick up on one thing that several of you pointed to and then come back to Uskali on this. So thickening, enriching, adding arguments to the utility function is one thing. But pointing out that those originally you can view those as errors of omission. The original theory just didn't focus on those, didn't say people were asocial, just ignore them. Errors of commission are another matter. And so, Uskali, you want to speak to that?
Let me just come back to Sam's. I mean, it's the idea that, because I categorized possible notions of Homo economicus. One of them would be generic notion of Homo. Whenever we talk about the economy and we have some notion of agency, then we have a notion of Homo economicus, regardless of the discipline, etc., etc. Are you bearing this guy as well?
Well, I think the term Homo economicus, no, that guy I like. And
Okay.
When I said
Okay.
intentionality, and by the way, I also mean constrained optimization, which I may get in trouble with you about. But I think those are really crucial. They're extremely valuable. I think we learn a lot from that. And I like that alternative, which is whatever it is we're trying to do has to be a part of our models, and we're going to do these things under constraints. And I think we do them in very often in ways that are forward-looking, not as idealized as we sometimes theorize. So I think that's important. But I want to come back, and I'm afraid what your answer is going to be. It must be obvious to you that I hope the time is ripe today for a rather fundamental change in economics of the magnitude that took place in the late 40s when Paul Samuelson convinced economists that we had to get aggregate demand into our models, fundamentally altering the textbook, putting macro before micro in his 48 textbook, by the way. Now, there's some particular circumstances that were happening then. The environment was not only the Great Depression, but the fact that a lot of business people had gone into the government during the war. Maybe the government wasn't such a big problem. Whole kind of things were going on. And there was some urgency. And you've thought a lot about this. I'm obviously an optimistic person. I think we both need and are going to get a fundamental transition in economics because of the twin crises of climate change and injustice. Because I think we have new economic tools which make it possible. It's not exactly the general theory plus the Great Depression, and I don't see the agents who pushed that, which is basically the working class and people who had suffered during the Great Depression. I think that's lacking now. We don't have that, a class which is saying, yes, we really would like to have unemployment benefits because that'll smooth out the cycle, and by the way, I need an unemployment check. So I think we may be missing the historical agency of a particular class which would benefit from the changes. But I mean, can't we hope for a change?
Yes, and
so
not only hope, but I mean, indeed, I mean, I think the major pressure would come from outside of the discipline. So once this ecological crisis marches on, etc., gets increasingly serious, then I think this will change the situation.
As it did in economics.
Yeah.
I mean,
So this might be it, but I mean, internally it's quite well protected, and
yeah, I know something about that.
yeah.
Can I speak to the sin of commission versus the
Yeah,
sin of
sure,
omission?
please.
So the way I presented the identity framework, I started out with the standard model, and then I added these identity ingredients. But there's no need to keep the standard model if we don't need it. And I think the sin of commission, if we think that when we write down these models and as how they've been traditionally written down, the sin of commission is by privileging a certain set of preferences, a certain area of preferences, say consumption and income, rather than things like morality, identity, social relations, and so on. So yes, there is a sin of commission, is that we've said this is what's important and this is what we're going to be working on. We've worked on it for generations, right? And that has led us down certain paths. But there's nothing to say that that was the right thing to do,
Sure.
that was correct empirically. We should have perhaps focused.
Well, but those are two different things. It might have been the right thing to do, and then given the self-correcting mechanisms of science, it's no longer the right thing to do because it's been attacked so much empirically.
Possibly, but it's, I guess I'm saying, blank slate, right? Why did people privilege, I don't know the answer to this, maybe you know. Why did we privilege a certain set of, preferences over a certain set of objects and not preferences over another set of objects? And this is taking as given the basic framework of this individual with intentionality who's making these decisions, right? So if we, by privileging a certain area or certain set of, let's call it goods and services, we've gone in a particular direction. And we know that there is increasing returns to all of these things and the way the profession works and so on. So, but I believe that it has set us down on a path that we perhaps shouldn't have gone down if we were really interested in handling some of the issues that Sam has been, talking about, for example.
No blank slates in science, just
Yeah.
as a matter of the
Right,
history. So
exactly.
again, back to Muscali's point about idealization. That's an idealization right there. You always start somewhere.
But I think the point has been made that maybe to some extent economists have sort of taken it that their job is technique rather than ethics, for example. So I mean, I'll give you an example. Take payday loans in America today. Most economists have heard of it. They know what it's about. Payday loans in America work the following. You are working insufficiently paid, which is not rare. You're running out of money before the end of the month, and you need $200. So you go to a payday lender, and you get $200, and you have to pay back $240 when you get paid. You have to be working. It's a payday loan. These are only the working poor. And you pay $240, and of course, if you didn't have $200 to finish the month this time, how are you going to have $240 next month? So what do? You take a payday loan. So the findings are that somebody who takes a payday loan in America today averages between 12 and 15 loans a year. Some findings, I don't know where it is now, but at some point the finding was that if you took a random payday loan given in America today, 70% of it went to pay a previous loan. So you're just money pumping at high interest. The implied APR could be 600-800%. Why is nobody doing anything? Now, what is the model here? The model here is the poor are not planning well. They're not maybe educated enough or knowing what to do correctly. But here's an example. You come home and there's a fire in the bedroom. And there's a bucket of water next. Do you stop and ask how much is the bucket? You grab it and you put it where the fire. It's our responsibility to make sure that the pay loans offered are plausible and payable. And this is economists' responsibility, but somehow they go and do the calculations and leave it to the ethicists to worry. They have the power. If the economists in Washington said, this is outrageous, we can't charge 800% on payday loan, they could get somewhere much better than we can, the behavioral types. But it just seems to be not the purview of the economists engaged in policy. And that, I think, is something, a point you're making, that could easily change. That's not a distant dream. Europe has, some states in the US, by the way, have capped payday loans, and many European countries, of course, have limited what you can charge.
I'd like to ask you a question, Rachel. First, I loved your presentation. I learned a lot from it. About all of yours. I've filled up my notes here. Your U sub j, with its augmented I and all of that, should we use that utility function to evaluate the outcomes of policies, or can we call one allocation better than the other if it's a Pareto improvement by those utility functions?
No, so it's a great question. I was actually going to say we should move to how do we understand efficiency and notions of efficiency and welfare analysis, given everything we've been talking about today. I don't think we've touched on it quite yet. Maybe you did, Sam, in your welfare triangles, but we haven't really delved into that. And I was going to shoot something back at you. So the answer is that I don't know, because of course it's from whose perspective. And in these models, you can have serious disagreements, right? And they have all of these externalities, which I didn't have a chance to really get into in my presentation. So you may act in a way which is consistent with who you think you are, but I may find it offensive. So then what do we do? So we have the dilemma of the Paretian liberal here. So do I say it's fine, everyone does what they want, but then when people do what they want, it can be harmful to other people. So this comes to your repugnant preference. Yes. I think your repugnant preferences. So I think our typical notions that we have, where we have welfare and we sum everything up, we sum up utilities and things like this. That's not particularly useful in these contexts, particularly when we know that the norms which are underlying these behaviors, which makes you feel like you do have to act in a certain way, and makes me feel offended by what you do, those are all subject to debate, and they're all subjects. These are all that people argue about, march about, fight about, and so on. So I don't think our standard tools work, and I'm not sure. And I'm not sure we should take a position on how we should. So I'm sure we should not take a position on. Let me say it differently. Our current tools and our current way of evaluating welfare are inappropriate for these contexts. What should replace them is yet another matter. But then I think we have to recognize that we are then ourselves are part of this whole system, where we ourselves are imposing our own norms about what we think might be appropriate and inappropriate. And so I think we're in a situation where I don't think we can really do that. Do the welfare analysis.
What about simple things, simple indices like the Gini coefficient? So as I understand it, looking from the outside, I'm a political economist coming in from poli-sci, just hanging out for a long time with economists. As I understand it, there's a lot more concern in the discipline about inequality. Right? Pinkerty, wrote that big book, and it got quite a bit of attention. I understand the Wall Street Journal has stopped putting scary quotation marks around inequality. It's very real. We know it's real. And you've got some tools for dealing with it, right?
Right. Well, so I think So the Gini coefficient is a measure.
Yeah.
Okay. What do we make of the measure becomes subject to our discussions and becomes subject to debate. Is inequality even a problem? We think it's a problem. Okay, why might inequality be a problem? Well, one reason it might be a problem is because we might think that it inhibits growth. Might be one reason. Another reason we might think inequality is a problem because it's simply unfair or unjust that some people have a lot and some people have a little. So when we take a look at something like the Gini coefficient and measures of inequality, what we make of it and how we want to study it and how we want to attack it and improve, if that's one measure of inequality, are all judgments, right, of our discipline and of society. So I think the Gini coefficient is a useful measure, but it's a useful measure because I personally think inequality is a problem. If people don't think inequality is a problem, why should they be caring about the Gini coefficient?
Per the Abba Lerner quote, every economic solution rests on an already solved political solution. If that isn't solved, then...
I think every time we say inequality, what we really think about is poverty. I think American economists have woken up to the fact that we have people who are as rich as nations, and we have massive amounts of deaths of despair and misery. It's not inequality, it's the fact that we have a country among the richest and most successful in history with an enormous number of people who cannot afford $400 in an emergency. It's 43% as of last report. So, I mean, I think inequality is misleading. I think if everybody was happy, inequality would bother people a lot less than where we are now.
I want to come back, Scully, to something you said. You mentioned the Homo economization of people, or something like that. It's an interesting idea. That is, a long-term experience with markets could turn people into more like Homo economicus. And of course, there's some evidence because of crowding out in experiments that market-like incentives tend to produce more selfish behavior. But I really doubt that, I'll put it this way, I don't think liberal society produces selfish individuals. And I don't really know why, but the empirical evidence for that is, one, I did a bunch of studies of cross-cultural experiments in which the greater exposure to markets was associated with greater generosity, the greater likelihood of rejecting unfair offers in an ultimatum game, and so on. And secondly, if you look at public goods experiments, for example, it's the societies that have had a longer experience with markets in which you find the very high levels of civic virtues on like public goods games. Copenhagen, Boston, and so on. And you look at places where capitalism has been in force for 3 centuries, not 1 century or half a century. So this is the idea that there's a hypothesis which was entertained by many people, including Schumpeter and Daniel Bell and others, that liberalism is a parasite on tradition. That basically liberal institutions rely on traditional values which it destroys. That seems to not be true. And that's a piece of good news. I think it has more to do with the liberal state and the rule of law than it does with markets. But I don't see that danger happening.
Can I ask something, Sam? Are these, when you talk about these societies with markets, or market-based society, they're not completely market-based societies. There's, there's other institutions and there's redistribution and there's other pieces to it. So it's not just free markets. So can you include those other elements of these societies in this analysis, or don't we need to?
Well, there are many different ways of measuring markets that we've tried, but an obvious one is what fraction of your livelihood is acquired through exchange. That's not bad. As in Sweden, it might be a little lower than the United States, and a hunting-gathering society would be very low, and so on. So we have measures of these things. We don't say that it's either or, it's a continuum. And
sorry, but just accompanying this market is also, say, a public education system. So to the extent that there's institutions alongside these markets that might be are helping to lead to these outcomes that you're talking about.
I'd be happy to entertain other measures. We've tried a whole lot. Okay. And it turns out that places that have had markets for a long time do pretty well on civic virtue, which is good news. But this is perhaps suggesting that I'm a nerd. One of the most interesting questions that I heard here was your observation that Kahneman and Tversky took off and Herbert Simon didn't. Do you understand that? I mean, I'm a huge admirer of Herbert Simon and also Kahneman and Tversky, but it is such an interesting question because Simon was just so far ahead of things. 1950, the first principal agent model of employment. That's pretty good. So do you have an idea?
Before you answer, I just want to add, I whispered to Deb in real time that I'm not sure they would agree with you that it was easier for them. They took some real abuse from the Solos of the world included. So it's an interesting question how one gauges the ease or difficulty with which one got there. But they they suffered for 20, 30 years before it picked up. I don't know how Simon experienced it, but.
He was in the wilderness, but he got the prize.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I do remember my early years as an economics student, and having read some of Simon, and then asked my professors how come Simon is not on our curriculum, etc. And the obvious response was, of course, Simon is right about satisficing, etc., but it cannot be incorporated into theory. So the tractability and the unity constraints were too strong, whereas story is different in the case of Kahneman.
So it doesn't
and I think actually our discussion today sort of exemplifies that, because it is focused more on the behavioral side of preferences than cognition. Eldar's talking being the exception to that. And Sam endorsing constrained optimization, if we could bring Simon back, he'd go, what the bleep I wrote about this not being, but I think it is a natural thing for a discipline to conserve if you want to publish and so
Right.
on and so on and so forth.
I want to say a couple things in response to the very interesting comments that were made. Benoit, you talked about, suppose you take what we now know about human behavior seriously. What do you do with that if you're, say, a mechanism designer or a policymaker? Well, there are now a lot of models of optimal policies with endogenous preferences. Suppose the policy itself is going to affect the preferences. Well, that's pretty obvious, and it's been suggested for a long time. And David, you do that in your book. You talk about the design of institutions knowing that that's going on. And so this isn't really, I don't mean to diminish your book, but the idea is around, and people are modeling it, and they're doing, it's standard mechanism design. It's just that you have the fact that the behavioral responses are themselves going to be depending on the policies, not just the incentives and constraints, but the evaluation of outcomes. A note about mathematics. I'm not sure I completely agree with you, because I'm not sure I fully understood you, but here's an amazing thing about economics. We're going to be the last theorem-based science because we don't use computational methods to solve problems. And everybody in this room knows how limiting it is to try to prove things formally. And of course, it's really fun if it works, but the limits of theorem-based reasoning really have been reached. And when I look around other disciplines, I'm at the Santa Fe Institute, where we do a huge amount of computation, and people just don't even talk about theorems very much anymore.
You're speaking to the choir here, because Ken does a lot of computation.
But I don't think, well, and it's true, by the way, I've had some experience with this. Publishing in journals, in top journals, where what you have is a lot of good evidence based on agent-based models, that's pretty hard. They want to know where the theorems are, still.
Do you want to go at this point?
You guys are finished interacting?
No, we're bouncing along. I think we.
Okay, so I suppose we're going to that way.
That was good, guy.
Where are you going?
To the microphone. I was told that questions to the panel have to be done from this microphone or the one over there.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay, I have a ton of things to say in response to what you said, but I'm going to try to keep it to my script. But one thing I have to say to Eldar is the idea that the economists have the power to change usury laws in the United States. The politicians have the power to do that, and they'll only listen to the economists as long as following the economists' advice will help them get more money for their re-election campaigns. And so, economists are not so powerful as it may seem from a Department of Psychology. Okay,
We don't have a council of psychological advisors.
well, there you go. So
Relative powerlessness.
So what I want to do is I want to make a confession. This is Kreps confessional, and get your reactions to it. And the confession starts with the fact that I teach in a business school, which is a strange experience for a lot of economists. But in a business school, I teach basic economics, and more lately human resource management to MBA students and other people who are practitioners. And I have taught, I've stopped teaching now, I taught general equilibrium and price theory to PhD students. And last night, we had dinner with 4 speakers and with John and Deb and Garth and Anat. And I was attacked on both sides for these things. First of all, the question was, why would you teach economic theory to MBA students? What can they possibly get out of that? And then Sam was, why do you teach this failed theory to the PhD students? Why waste their time? Okay, so here's my confession. This is why I do what I do. When I teach theories to MBA students, what I'm after is giving them some insight into real-world circumstances. And, teach a theory, give a case, say, doesn't the theory help you understand the case? Now, this colleague last night attacked me on, what is this word insight? What do you mean by insight? And I tried to come up with a definition, tried to refine it today. I'm going to take the dodge of Potter Stewart, famous United States Supreme Court Justice, who said, I don't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it. Well, I don't know how to define insight, but I know it when I see it. So that's why I do that. Now, the dean some time ago made me teach human resource management to the MBA students with a sociologist named Jim Barron. And I came to the conclusion, and this speaks to, there's been a lot of talk about markets today. I've come to the conclusion that certainly in the employment relationship, and more generally, a lot of economic exchange doesn't go through what we think of as a market. It's person to person, it's organization to person, and in those sorts of things, the relationship, the long-term relationship between the parties becomes very important. It's not a market transaction. So, what is it? We don't have to understand what Mrs. Jones is doing to understand economics. Well, in those relationships, you have to understand what Mrs. Jones is doing. And they're important I think, frankly, I think that it's convenient for me to say this. I think they're more important than market interactions in many cases, these sorts of relationships that people have with one another, between organizations. To understand them, you have to understand that they're not just economic relationships, they're also social relationships. They're important. Therefore, I want to see Homo economicus take into account the social effects or social effects on what they do. Okay, and so that's why I think that the classic version of Homo economicus has got to evolve into somebody who, for those kinds of transactions at least, cares about other people, where context matters, things like that. That's my case for that. On the other hand, I taught general equilibrium, demand theory, stuff like that. And as Sam said, why do you bother teaching this failed theory? Why do you waste a third of their first year graduate education teaching this? Well, I know you've undoubtedly heard the fable about the economist who loses his keys out in the field and is searching under the searchlight in the street because there's light there and he can't see what's going on in the field. Well, John Roberts takes credit for the following elaboration of that story, which is, rather than going out into the field and working in the dark, what you should do is you should start in the street and start extending a sequence of searchlights or street lights out into the field, because the street where you start is where the electricity is. I want to teach general equilibrium because that's where you start to get out into the field eventually. Okay, that's my confessional. Have fun.
I've thought a lot about whether, when I was in high school, I studied French, and because my father said that's a language of diplomacy, and he said, but you should learn Latin first, because if you learn Latin first, then you can learn French. And I think learning Walrasian general equilibrium is kind of like learning Latin. I was not convinced of it. I think it's a very interesting special case, but you and I have different ideas about teaching, and it's very demanding what you're talking about. You know that because you devote a lot of attention to it. I think there's a lot to be learned by studying the Erudibro model, but I think we can aspire to having a more general model as the thing which we start with. Now, you may think it's too hard, like it's like out in the dark out there. But you know, one of the reasons why we think that a lot of the innovations in economic theory are hard is because they tend to be taught to upper level undergrads because they're often taught by new assistant professors and so on who are not allowed to teach the basic courses. And that's why, for example, game theory was thought to be hard, because it was always taught to juniors and seniors. It was never taught to first-year students. Well, I designed a curriculum for intro which starts with game theory. By the way, a little bit like Mascale, Winston, and Green. They don't get to markets until chapter 8, just like Samuelson in his 1948 textbook. So the fact that something was introduced late in the game by younger people means it looks hard because they're highly mathematized. But that stuff can be taught. Now, I mean, I say that, and we differ. You have a lot of experience teaching. I think your textbook, by the way, is so much better than Mascale, Winston, and Green. I thought it was going to sweep the, in fact, I told my colleagues at UMass, this has to be the text. And unfortunately, the economics profession isn't as wise as it ought to be. But I think there's a real question about why do you, unless you think that the thing that the thing you really want to teach at the end really needs the stuff before, then particularly if the stuff that you're teaching is really fundamentally misleading. Now, think about classical physics and quantum physics. If you design bridges using classical physics, you're not going to get it very wrong. But if you design an economy using neoclassical economics, you are going to get it wrong. And so I think we ought not to take that as our benchmark.
Can I do a one-sentence response to that?
Yeah, sure.
I hope people can hear me. I agree with you if I'm teaching MBA students. My MBA textbook starts with the economics of relationships. I don't get to markets until much later in the book. Teaching PhD students.
Mike.
So I'm not going to repeat what I just said. When I teach PhD students, it's a different matter. They're part of an intellectual tradition. They're joining a profession. They should know where we came from.
In terms of the pedagogy, it's clearly an empirical hypothesis,
that's right.
as Sam emphasized, and we don't know the answer to it.
Yeah, but you don't teach mercantilism, and you don't teach Ricardo, and you don't teach a whole lot of stuff, which is where we came from. So that particular thing is the thing you want them to learn that we came from. That's a question, isn't it?
Any questions from the audience?
So I wanted to go back to the welfare analysis, because I think one of the obstacles to do what Sam says is, and this applies very much to Elder and Sam point, is how do we think about what's repugnant, if you want, or what's the moral? And Elder actually made a point about teaching financial literacy, that it's somehow someone decided that was important. So in some way, I think economists are intimidated, maybe I'm being too nice, to economists are intimidated by the idea of taking a stance. At the same time, we took a stance. And we, exercise, especially at the undergraduate level, a certain social engineering, because we taught them there is a way of thinking. So, in some way, we got into this contradiction. But I think the real need is for a tool, and I don't know if this is simply empirical based, or what is supposed to be without running into a paternalistic situation in which we may be wrong, by the way, how do we choose? What are the preferences? What are the mistakes, if you want? Or what are the things that are, in an identity setting, how do you choose between one versus the other? That's intimidating to economists, because I think we always were taught, and maybe wrongly so, the welfare analysis is a fundamental way of choosing policies. And so that is, key, I think, to make progress.
Can I just say something really quick? So a welfare analysis, you might say that you we might be using it to pick policies or something. But it's not, so when I was saying before that we can't use those tools to make those conclusions, it doesn't mean that we can't talk about gainers and losers, right? And then who ends up gaining and losing, then it becomes almost a political question as to who's in power. So there's all these discussions of power and who's going to end up gaining and who's going to end up losing. And so, it's not that we have to throw away the idea of looking at the effects of our policies, but we don't necessarily have to do the balance that we typically, nor should we do the balance. We can't, but we can point it out. Say, if we go this way, this is what is going to happen, or not what's going to happen. These people will, there will be following effects on these folks, following effects on these folks, and following effects on, on this other set of people.
I think it would help also, you made a suggestion in your talk that we should interrogate why we take some domains of well-being as part of what we analyze, like, for example, purchasing power, and others, like, for example, liberty or dignity, as not part of it. I mean, that seems like a pretty elementary mistake. But the problem of a society saying, I mean, take the idea of repugnant preferences. I think it's a dangerous idea that some preferences are repugnant, because we know the consequences of empowering a state to teach us what a good person is. However, we don't have the option of not doing that. What's going on in America right now is a debate about whether it's okay to be trans in high school. And that's essentially a society deciding that people who are trans are either okay or not. And it goes on all the time. We're deciding, is it okay to have books in libraries that have certain senses in them about men, women, people of color, gay people, and so on. The debate is happening all around us. Our society wants to bring up people to be a certain way morally. And I suggested, using Habermas's ultra-democratic views about that we have to do this, and we'd be better off recognizing that we're doing it instead of saying we don't do it because of some liberal neutrality, which we never, ever abide by. We have to reject that as something which is a societal objective, and just face the facts that we're raising children, we're raising each other, we're turning out to be certain kinds of moral individuals, and we do have opinions about which ones of those are consistent with a free society in the long run. And if you believe in a free society, you'd better not just ignore that.
Can I just amplify that a bit? So if we add on to that the social categories that I was talking about during my talk, it's not only a moral person, it's, what does it mean to be, right, what does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean to be a Texan? There's this wonderful article in the New York Times that say the identity of Texans is changing. And what's that going to mean actually for energy policy, for example? So all of these debates are happening out there. And it's kind of rich for us to say, oh, well, we're just not going to engage in these debates. They're happening. And if we want to understand, if we feel that we should be contributing to the understanding, if we're social scientists, so say that's our identity, as social scientists, and we want to understand the dynamics within a society, then we have to, it's imperative upon us to study these dynamics. We can't just not see them. We can't not look at them and try and understand them. Doesn't mean we have to take a position, which is going yet one step further. We at least have to recognize that these debates, these arguments are happening, and there are power dynamics and economic dynamics inside of them as well, because some people are profiting off of these dynamics. We've had examples of that along the way as well today.
I would add to that. I mean, your question is excellent, but I think it's not economists' responsibility. It should be a joint effort. I mean, Angus Deaton, in his last book, by the way, makes a similar case, and David implemented it. I mean, you're supposed to work with philosophers, geographers, biologists, behavioral scientists to figure out what's the right welfare. I mean, in a sense, economists took it upon themselves, and it's both unfair and inefficient. And it's really, the feminist author Marilyn Frye has a beautiful example of a bird cage. And she says, if you look at one grill of the cage up and down the whole time, you can't understand why the bird doesn't fly around it. It's only when you see all of them together that you understand what's happening to the bird. And I think all of us are not doing that. We're experts on housing and experts on interest rate. And you need to have that view of the cage to get it right. And obviously this is a dream, but I think that's a direction. That's kind of what happened here in some sense.
Did you have a question?
Hi. I guess I agree that the old-fashioned Homo economicus, did I say that right? Is an I believe what we understood to be an ideal type. I also disagree with Sam, but love his quote from John Stuart Mill, since I think that describes what economists are good at: how to allocate resources in an economic setting, in an organized setting, in particular in a market economy. Bob Solow described the success of economics as formalizing greed, rationality, and equilibrium. I think that's what we're good at, and I think there's a lot else about human behavior that needs explaining, and policy. Those are areas of ethics, anthropology, and psychology. They're not what economists are good at.
Mill did say not only that we're talking about the allocation of wealth, we're saying we should treat people as if that's all they care about. And we know that's empirically wrong. So he's saying we should be bad scientists. I really disagree with you, Ross. But, we've probably disagreed forever, probably about general equilibrium too. We've known each other for about how many years? Just
about 60.
About 60, right?
Scully?
Yeah, well, Mill knew it was wrong.
What?
Mill also knew it was wrong.
Yes, of course he said.
was very deliberate about
he called this
making a wrong
an
claim.
arbitrary view of man. That's a quote from Mill, right after
Ah, yeah.
arbitrary view.
Arbitrary is, given David's story or Robert's elaboration of it, arbitrary is a lot stronger than I think the history of science will support in this case.
No, but
I've been arguing with David for 40 years about behavioral issues, but I've come to believe from the history of science point of view, there's no compelling evidence that there was a better path. There may have been, but I don't think we'll ever figure out whether there was. Now I agree with you, Sam, of course. Now it's time to move on.
Well, I think when I started teaching micro, I'm to blame, or at least I was one of the first with a co-teacher, to teach advanced micro to grad students entirely through problem sets. So I was into mathematizing. I had Chamberlain and Leontief as my teachers, and I became a modern micro teacher just doing problem sets, solving math problems. And that was associated with a vast narrowing of the topics. Now, this was in the mid-60s. So you think about who we had, who we could have drawn on. We had Coase, we had Hayek, we had Nash, we had von Neumann. We had many other people we could have actually made central to the curriculum. We had Simon. And these are people who could have been what we were teaching. And that's not what we did. We taught fancy constrained optimization through using problem sets. I consider, more or less starting then until more or less the 80s or 90s, I call it the Walrasian detour. Now, I published a paper in the QJE about which I wanted to call it the Walrasian detour, and there was a lot of opposition to that. And the editors said, "Well, didn't we have to learn all of that in order to do what we're doing now?" And look what I just told you. We already knew the insights of Coase, von Neumann, Hayek, and so on. We knew them then. And we just essentially went to sleep for 30 years. And what did we do? During that period, were we learning how to do constrained optimization? Is it really that hard? That we had to take 30 years off of studying the insights of the great economists who I just mentioned? I don't think so. I think it really was a detour. And I promoted that. I'm part of that.
That's a real bouillabaisse when you throw Herb Simon in with Coase. it's not clear that there's any direction.
Oh no! Wait a minute.
Come out of that.
Herb Simon's paper of 1950 was exactly a model of authority within the firm.
And he rapidly departed from that and started emphasizing cognitive limits, which Coase never touched. And Hayek explored, but he didn't realize what he had. And it took March and Simon, in their book on organizations later, to explore what Hayek had really meant. So it's a rich bouillabaisse, don't get me wrong, but I think it's too rich.
Well, I think we probably would have realized what you said a lot quicker had we not been just working on problem sets over that period.
I think the problem sets idea is great.
I do too. I still use problem
I think
sets.
that's
My
fabulous.
students hate my problem sets and so on.
That's a
So
sunk
this
cost.
gets back to what we do as economists, right? We do problem sets, you know. So it's it's part of what defines.
What's better?
Well,
Not what's good, but what's better.
but
You're
I'm-
dealing with very complex phenomena.
no, I'm not saying we shouldn't do I'm not saying we shouldn't do problem sets. Maybe we should only do problem sets. But I'm just saying that our methods. One thing we also haven't talked a lot about here is our methods,
Yeah.
right? Our methods are we build these mathematical models. So a typical theory paper says there's a wonderful, you know, sentence in the beginning about the big problem that this paper is about. Then we go into this introduction, and then we narrow it down to the model that's actually of the paper, and then we sort of bring it back out again. But we build mathematical models, and we have to get, you know, in order to be published in some top 5 journal, almost still now, we need analytical results, right?
Yeah.
So this is something, and then we can do it. I can do a similar.
I think Ken Judd is right about that. I mean, it's weird when you look at the natural sciences. They've been doing computational modeling for decades. And it's, and so the profession's weird that way.
Right, and so we've expanded our methods in terms of obviously empirical methods, right? So we have the computation power to allow us to attack bigger and larger data, et cetera, et cetera. We have experimental methods, which we didn't have before, and so on. But sort of the advances of our, I'll call it in the idea space, if it's still coming through theory, is coming through this rather constrained way of writing. And that's what we don't have. We were discussing this earlier. We don't really have a forum to have these kinds of discussions, except what you've given us here, David, to think about how are we doing it, what are the ideas that we're attacking, how are we attacking them, and how could we be doing it better?
Yeah, I started graduate school as a math major. I'd been a math major as an undergraduate, and then as a math grad student, I had to take 2 years of more math courses before I took a qualifying exam. Then, well, the job market in math looked pretty depressing in the late 70s, so I switched to economics. All he had to do is take 1 year of courses, and economics students come in knowing nothing. Even if they had been an economics major as an undergraduate, they didn't learn anything then. 1 year, and then they take exams, and I hear now they don't even do that. And then they're supposed to be ready for research. What's wrong with, I agree, they should be better trained. They should know about Ricardo and these guys. They should know the history, the philosophy. Why not make it 2 years of courses? Why not train them in all of these things? These are great ideas. Let's do them all, as opposed to, well, we got to squeeze it into the 1 year, so we got to throw half the stuff out. That's I think, the nutty thing about graduate education.
I think everyone should read Sam's book. That would be part of the graduate curriculum.
And we can ask John Levin whether he'd support 6 or 7 years to PhD.
Yeah. Since Rachel mentioned, we were talking about the resistance of journals to publish things, I have to tell the story, which is I wrote a couple of papers with a former PhD student. It had some theorems in them. They weren't very useful theorems, but they were pretty clever in how the proof went. But most of the papers were simulation results. And I submitted it to all the big 5. That was rejected by 3 of them and rejected after every reports by the other 2. The RE Studies, the editor wrote, I really like this paper, but I have to consider my readers. And then I went to JET, and the guy at JET said, this is the Journal of Economic Theory, not simulations. So, you do that kind of stuff, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting it published in standard journals.
Yeah.
David, before you leave the mic, I would love, and I think other people here would love to hear also, you're the 3rd volume of your Foundations of Economic Theory.
Oh, God.
No, honestly, he's putting his money down on what we should actually be doing. And he's been doing this all his life, And he's got one of the best textbooks out there already. So tell us what's in your third volume.
Well, right now, I mean, I have been struggling with what goes into the third volume. Right now, what it's going to be is it's going to say, this is volume 2, which is information economics, has no mention of firms whatsoever. I mean, they enter a few models, but it's not a model of firm. Volume 3 is supposed to be theory of the firm from the models that conform to the neoclassical version of Homo economicus, but very quickly bleeds into incomplete contracts, transaction cost economics, and then why I don't think that quite gets it, and then becomes very behavioral. That right now is the plan. You know, see me in 5 years if I manage to do it.
David is a dominant convinced of economics.
Yes, except I didn't invent a TypeScript.
Well, thanks everybody for your attention. This has been a very lively conference.
So we're wrapping here. So first of all, can we thank the speakers?
Thank you, guys.
Good job, guys.
And thanks to John and Deb, who were as responsible for this program as I was. And putting this thing together, Kristen Lim, and where's Celia? Over at Vitellakis. So they put up with a, you know, sort of a contact person who meddled much too much in the day-to-day runnings of this conference.
Thank you. Thanks to David.